14-year-old kills 3 people and shows no remorse until the judge destroys his ego. 14-year-old Evan Calder walked into that courtroom with his chin held high and a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 3 people were dead. 3, his foster parents. A neighbor who tried to stop him. The judge read the charges with a voice heavy as stone. First-degree murder times 3. And Evan, he swung his feet like a bored student in study hall. He mouthed the word okay to his attorney, as if the prosecutor had just asked him to pass the salt. 14 years old, 3 bodies, and not a shred of fear in his eyes. He honestly believed his age would save him. He had no idea the judge was about to teach him the most brutal lesson of his life. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. No matter how young the perpetrator or how confident they are in escaping it. If you believe in real accountability and the power of the law to restore balance, subscribe now and tell us in the comments what you think justice truly means. Does age excuse intent? Let's discuss below. Now this is how it all began. The truth is, Evan Calder came into his foster home with a history already written. Records of expulsions, anger management failures, and escalating aggression. His foster parents, Richard and Susan, took him in anyway. They were the kind of people who believed in second chances, who saw potential where the system saw risk. They set rules, curfews at 10, screens off at 9, respect at all times. These weren't cruel boundaries. They were the scaffolding of structure that Evan had never had. Susan kept a journal. In one entry from 3 months before the crime, she wrote, "Today Evan smiled at dinner. A real smile. I think he's finally starting to trust us." She had no way of knowing that behind that smile lived something else entirely. Something cold and calculating that watched the neighborhood from his window at night. Something that had already begun planning the unthinkable. The courtroom fell silent when the bailiff called the case. Evan Calder's name echoed off the walls like a question no one wanted answered. He wore a gray hoodie that made him look smaller than his frame actually was, a calculated choice by his public defender. 14 looked younger than 25. 14 looked like it might deserve mercy. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Halloway, had seen 17 years on the bench and could smell a performance from across the room. She watched as Evan shuffled to his seat, his mother in the gallery behind him, her face already broken before the charges were even read. The courtroom was packed, reporters in the back, family members in the front rows, the kind of attention that only 3 deaths in a quiet suburb could summon. The air felt heavy, pressurized, like the moment before a storm breaks. When the prosecutor stood to read the indictment, her voice was steady and clinical. 3 counts of first-degree murder, premeditation, cruelty, depravity of heart. The words hung in the air like objects you could almost touch. Evan's lawyer, a man named Derek Walsh, who had already aged 10 years fighting an unwinnable case, placed a hand on his client's shoulder. But Evan wasn't listening to the charges. He was looking at the gallery, at the empty chairs where his victims' families sat, and something flickered across his face. Not fear, not sadness, but something closer to amusement. When the prosecutor said the names aloud, Richard Calder, Susan Calder, Thomas Brennan, Evan's foot began to swing under the table, a rhythmic motion like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. The courtroom photographer caught it. The image would later run in newspapers across 3 states. A child sneaker swinging, indifferent, while justice tried to answer for the dead. The detective's report was read into the record first. Evan had been arrested 18 hours after the crime, found asleep in his best friend's basement, the murder weapon already recovered and logged as evidence. There had been no chase, no drama, no moment of teenage panic. He had simply walked away from the house on Meridian Street at 10:52 p.m., adjusted his hoodie in the glow of a neighbor's doorbell camera, and disappeared into the Tuesday night like someone leaving a movie theater. The detective described the scene with the kind of detachment that only comes from years of documenting human tragedy. The bedroom walls, the kitchen floor, the neighbor's front porch where Thomas Brennan had fallen trying to call for help. 47 seconds. That was how long the violence lasted according to the forensic timeline. 47 seconds of sound and fury that would echo through a community for years. And Evan had walked away from it in under 3 minutes, his heart rate probably stable, his hands probably steady. His mind already composing the lie he would tell when caught. The courtroom observers, seasoned crime reporters who had covered murders in the city's worst neighborhoods, found themselves disturbed by something other than the facts. It was his stillness. A typical 14-year-old defendant cried, fidgeted, showed some sign of the internal collapse that should come with facing such charges. Evan sat like he was waiting for a bus. During the reading of the forensic evidence, when photographs of the crime scene were shown to the judge and jury, Evan actually turned to look at the evidence table, examining it with the kind of casual interest someone might show when looking at a neighbor's car. His attorney whispered something urgent to him, a warning probably, to show more appropriate emotion, but Evan simply nodded and turned back to face forward. Judge Holloway watched all of it. She was writing notes, not looking at the defendant, but her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. She had seen plenty of guilty men in her courtroom. Most of them at least had the basic human decency to appear disturbed by what they had done. Evan Calder looked like he was thinking about what he wanted for lunch. By the time the prosecution rested its opening statement, the narrative was already clear to everyone present. A troubled teenager imported into a stable home had rejected the structure and kindness offered to him. He had stolen a handgun from his friend's garage 3 weeks prior. He had researched online whether minors could receive life sentences. He had written in his school journal, seized by police, entered as evidence that he was tired of being controlled. And then, on a Tuesday evening in September, he had acted. The violence was swift and methodical. The escape was calm and calculated. And now, sitting in a courtroom surrounded by the consequences of his actions, he had the audacity to look bored. The jury members were taking notes, but their eyes kept returning to the same question. How does a child become this? What break occurs in a 14-year-old mind that allows him to commit 3 murders and then sit in a courtroom with the kind of emotional distance most people reserve for waiting in line at the grocery store? Judge Holloway had her own theory. She had read the psychological evaluations, the trauma history, the incident reports from his previous placements. But she would save her judgment for later. For now, the trial had to proceed. The facts had to be presented. The evidence had to be examined. And Evan Calder would have to watch as everyone in that room, the judge, the jury, the families, the reporters, came to understand exactly what he was. The gavel hadn't fallen yet. But already in the silence of that courtroom, it felt like a sentence had been written. Richard Calder was a man who believed in systems. He worked in logistics, managing supply chains for a manufacturing company, the kind of job that required precision, planning, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. At 48 years old, he had a structured routine: coffee at 5:30, the gym at 6, the office by 8, dinner at 6 in the evening. His wife, Susan, was a middle school guidance counselor who believed in second chances with the kind of fervor that only comes from having worked with enough broken teenagers to know that brokenness isn't permanent. Together, they had created a home on Meridian Street that was stable in a way that made neighbors feel safe just walking past it. The lawn was trimmed every Saturday. The house was painted a soft blue with white trim. There were flower beds that Susan tended with surgical precision, and a porch where they sat on summer evenings with glasses of iced tea and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from two people who have learned to live well together. They had wanted children, biological children, but biology hadn't cooperated, and after years of procedures and heartbreak, they had made a different choice: foster care. It was noble in theory, and it had led to 3 successful placements before Evan arrived. A girl named Melissa had lived with them for 14 months and had gone on to graduate high school and attend community college. A boy named Marcus had stayed for 9 months before being reunited with his father, and another girl, Jenny, had been with them for 2 years before aging out of the system and moving into a group home. These placements had reinforced Richard and Susan's belief that they had something to offer, that a home with structure and genuine care could redirect a life headed toward darkness. They were not naive. The agency had prepared them for behavioral issues, emotional dysregulation, the kind of trauma that follows a child who has been neglected or abused. They were ready for challenges. They were not ready for what Evan would bring. The file on Evan was substantial. 3 previous placements, all ended by request of the foster parents. 2 expulsions from school for fighting and insubordination. A battery charge when he was 12. He had beaten another student with a textbook after being corrected in class. Anger management counseling, failed. Psychiatric evaluation, inconclusive. The caseworker who brought him to Meridian Street had been honest. He's a difficult placement, but he's also intelligent and capable of bonding when he feels respected. Give him structure and genuine interest, and you might reach him. Richard and Susan had nodded, taken notes, and welcomed him into their home with the kind of optimistic determination that made people love them, even when their choices seemed reckless. On the first evening, Susan had made his favorite meal, requested from his file, and Richard had shown him around the house, explaining the house rules in the way he explained everything, clearly, logically, with the understanding that consequences followed naturally from choices. The rules were not arbitrary. They were designed with care. Curfew at 10 on school nights, 11 on weekends. Screen time had limits, but Evan could earn additional time through completed homework and household responsibilities. Meals were together, phones away from the table. Respect was the foundation, respect for the home, respect for the family, respect for himself. There would be consequences for violations, but they would be consistent and fair. No yelling, no physical punishment, just the natural architecture of a life where actions had results. For the first 6 weeks, Evan seemed to respond. He went to school without incident. He helped with dishes without being asked. He even smiled sometimes, real smiles that made Susan's heart feel lighter. She documented these moments in her journal, small victories that felt like proof of concept. He asked me about my job today, actually asked. Then he told me about this book he's reading. For the first time, I think he might actually belong here. These entries would later be read aloud during trial, each one a small betrayal of the hope that had preceded catastrophe. But structure and care, it turned out, were not enough. Or perhaps they were the very things that Evan had learned to resent. The control they represented, even when offered with genuine affection, fed something in him that grew darker with each passing week. He began to push against the boundaries. Small violations at first. Staying up past curfew, sneaking his phone into his bedroom, making subtle comments to Susan about how unfair the rules were compared to his friends' households. Richard tried to address these escalations with the same logical consistency he brought to everything else, but Evan was not operating under the rules of logic. He was operating under the rules of resentment. By month 3 of his placement, something had shifted. The small acts of defiance became more calculated. He stopped participating in family meals, claiming he wasn't hungry. He began spending time in the garage, keeping the door locked. Neighbors reported seeing him standing in the backyard at night, staring at houses, making notes in a small notebook. Richard asked him about it once, and Evan had smiled that cold smile and said, "Just thinking about stuff." That notebook would later be recovered by police. It contained sketches of the house's layout, observations about when people came and went, and several pages of writing that psychiatrists would later describe as preoccupation with power, control, and retribution. But in the moment, Richard and Susan saw only a troubled teenager, still adjusting to his new home, still healing from whatever wounds had been inflicted before he arrived. They could not see that the house that was supposed to save him was becoming the stage for his greatest act of violence. Richard Calder's day on the morning of September 15th began like almost every other day of his adult life. He woke at 5, showered, dressed in the khaki pants and blue button-down that was his weekday uniform, and went downstairs to the kitchen where the coffee maker was already programmed to brew. He had set it the night before, another small act of planning, another small victory of structure over chaos. Susan was still asleep. She had worked late at the middle school, staying to counsel a student whose parents were divorcing, absorbing the girl's tears and fear, and trying to pour confidence back into her. Susan did this often, stayed late, brought work home, carried the emotional weight of other people's children because she believed that small interventions at key moments could redirect lives. This belief had guided every major decision in her marriage. The decision to foster, the decision to open their home to children, the system had labeled unmanageable, the decision to try again with Evan when others had given up. Richard supported this belief because he loved her and because, in his logical way, he understood that kindness was a calculus that usually paid dividends. He drank his coffee and checked his email on his phone, responding to messages from the supply chain, coordinating shipments, managing the dozens of small decisions that kept commerce flowing smoothly. At 6, he would go to the gym. At 7, he would return and wake Susan with a kiss. They would have breakfast together, and she would tell him about the girl she had counseled, and he would listen in the way he had learned to listen after 22 years of marriage, with genuine interest and the kind of presence that comes from having decided long ago that this woman's concerns were his concerns. Thomas Brennan lived 3 houses down from the Calders in a small rambler he had bought after his retirement from the military at 52. He was a quiet man, the kind of neighbor who maintained his property without fanfare and knew the names of people's dogs, but asked few personal questions. He had been a helicopter pilot in his younger years, had logged thousands of hours above landscapes that wanted to kill him, had learned to trust his instruments and his training and the men beside him. Retirement had not suited him well. His wife had left him years earlier, unable to tolerate the distance that the military had burned into him. He had no children, so he focused on small things. His garden, his morning walks around the neighborhood, helping other homeowners with projects that required the kind of precision and mechanical aptitude that military service had taught him. He was the man who had fixed Susan's fence after a winter storm, who had helped Richard install a new water heater, who embodied the kind of quiet competence that made the neighborhood feel safer. On the morning of September 15th, Thomas had done what he did most mornings, risen early, made coffee, checked his blood pressure medication. He was careful about these things, aware that the body accumulated damage over time, and sat on his porch to watch the day begin. He had noticed Evan Calder in the neighborhood, had seen him standing in yards at odd hours, had made a mental note to mention it to Richard. He had also noticed something else, something harder to articulate. A coldness in the boy's eyes when he looked at the homes on the street, as if he was assessing them, cataloging them, determining their value and their vulnerability. In the Calder household on that September morning, Evan woke late. He had not slept well. His mind had been occupied with something that had been growing in him for weeks, something that had started as a fantasy and had slowly solidified into something that felt increasingly inevitable. He lay in his bed, the bed that Susan had bought for him, in the room that Richard had helped him paint, in the house that had tried so hard to be safe, and he felt the weight of the structure pressing down on him, the rules, the expectations, the constant, relentless demand that he be better, do better, become someone other than what he was, the bathroom rules, the curfew. The way Richard's eyes would tighten when Evan came home late or forgot his homework. The way Susan would ask him questions about his feelings in that counselor voice, as if talking about emotions could somehow fix the emptiness that he felt inside. He had tried, in his own way, to explain it to her once. They were sitting in the kitchen, and she had asked him why he seemed angry all the time, and he had said, "I'm not angry, I just don't like being told what to do." And she had responded in that patient voice, "We all have things we don't want to do, Evan. That's called being part of a family." That had been a moment, he would later tell psychologists, when he had truly decided. He could not escape this house through normal means. He could not convince them that their rules were wrong, their expectations unreasonable, their love a form of control. The only way out was through violence, and the only way to make sure he never came back was to make sure there was no one left to demand his return. That afternoon, Evan did his homework at the kitchen table while Susan prepared dinner. She had asked him about his day at school, and he had given her the answers she wanted to hear. Yes, his math test had gone well. No, there hadn't been any conflicts. Yes, he was starting to feel like Meridian Street was becoming home. It was performance, but it was convincing performance. They were good actors, both of them. He in his role as the recovering teenager, she in her role as the patient foster mother, waiting for the moment when love would win. At 4 o'clock, Richard called from the office to say he would be home by 6. At 5, Susan's phone rang, and she spent 15 minutes talking to her mother about a family gathering scheduled for October. Everything was proceeding with the rhythm of an ordinary life, full of ordinary plans and ordinary expectations about the future. Richard was thinking about a promotion that might come through in the spring. Susan was already mentally planning a birthday party for Evan in March, imagining the cake she would bake, the friends she could invite, the moment when he might truly begin to feel like he belonged. Thomas Brennan was watering his garden and noting that the tomato plants were producing well this year. And Evan, sitting at the kitchen table with his algebra textbook open in front of him, was thinking about the handgun he had hidden in the garage 3 weeks earlier, about the moment when everything would change, about the freedom that only violence could provide. The ordinary world was about to collide with something it was entirely unprepared for. And no one in that house or in that neighborhood had any way of knowing that the day of reckoning was only hours away. The evening had proceeded with the kind of normalcy that would later make investigators question whether they had missed warning signs. At 6 o'clock, Richard arrived home carrying take-out Thai food, a Friday treat, even though it was Tuesday. He had stopped at the restaurant on impulse, wanting to do something kind for his family, wanting to surprise them. They ate at the dining table, all 3 of them, and Evan seemed engaged in a way he hadn't been in weeks. He told them about a project for his history class, about a teacher who had complimented his writing, about a girl in his English class who had asked him for a pencil. These were small things, the kind of conversational threads that make a family feel connected. Susan beamed. Richard asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and Evan responded to each one with words that seemed to come from a place of genuine connection. At 7:30, they watched television together in the living room, a cooking show that Richard liked, a program about making difficult recipes from simple ingredients. Evan sat on the opposite end of the couch from Susan, his body language open, his attention seemingly focused on the screen. No one could have known that his mind was elsewhere, that he was mentally walking through the next hours, that he was feeling the pull of something that had been building inside him for weeks, like pressure before a rupture. At 9 o'clock, Richard announced his intention to go to bed early. He had a meeting at 7 in the morning, a conference call with suppliers in California, dealing with time zone complications. He kissed Susan on the forehead, told Evan to lock up and keep the noise down, and disappeared upstairs. Susan remained in the living room, reading a book, a mystery novel she was halfway through. She had no particular awareness that this was significant, that this separation, Richard upstairs in the master bedroom, her downstairs with her book, had created the geometry that Evan had been waiting for. At 9:40, Evan said he was tired and was going to bed. He went upstairs, and for 14 minutes he simply waited in his room, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Richard snoring softly down the hallway. Susan's footsteps as she moved around downstairs. The hum of the refrigerator. The ticking of the heating system. Everything measured and recorded in his mind like coordinates on a map. At 9:54, Evan went downstairs to the garage. He moved quietly, the way he had practiced moving in his room, the way he had been practicing for weeks. The handgun was where he had hidden it, in a can of paint thinner on a high shelf, wrapped in a plastic bag. He had stolen it from his friend Marcus's house 6 weeks earlier, had brought it home piece by piece, had assembled it in his room with hands that never trembled. He had fired it twice in a secluded area near the river, practicing the motion, understanding the recoil, familiarizing himself with the small engine of death he now held. He had also obtained a knife from the kitchen months earlier, had sharpened it, had tested it on fruit to understand how resistance felt when a blade met resistance. These were not impulsive actions. They were the result of sustained planning, of research conducted on library computers and through phone browsers cleared from history. He had read about juvenile sentences, about the protections that minors received in court, about the psychological evaluations that might find him diminished in capacity. He had come to believe through this research and through some internal calculus that only he understood, that he could commit this act and that the system would treat him as a child, even as he had committed an act of profound adult evil. At 9:57, Evan walked upstairs with the gun in his hand. His heart rate was probably elevated, but not dramatically. His hands were steady. His mind was clear with the clarity that comes from action after prolonged anticipation. He went into his room and knocked on Richard's door, something he rarely did. Richard opened it, confused, already halfway into sleep. "What's wrong?" he asked. That was all he said. That was all he had time to say. Evan raised the gun. Richard's expression changed in that final moment from confusion to understanding to something like sorrow, as if he had just realized that his faith in the power of structure and kindness to heal had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The shot was loud in the enclosed space of the bedroom. Richard fell. Evan fired again, and then a third time, the violence sudden and shocking in its simplicity. He turned and ran to Susan's location. She had heard the shots, the first one certainly, and was coming up the stairs, her face a mask of confusion and terror. Evan fired at her from the landing. She fell backward. Tumbling down the stairs, her body striking angles and edges on the way down. She tried to crawl, tried to reach her phone. Evan came down the stairs and finished what he had started. 2 more shots, and she was still. By 10:03, it was over for 2 of them. The third act was approaching. Thomas Brennan in his house 3 doors down had heard the sounds through his window. Sharp reports that his military experience identified immediately as gunfire. He knew what to do. He called 911. He didn't wait for instructions. He grabbed his phone and his light and went to the Calder house. The door was unlocked. He entered calling out names. And Evan, standing in the kitchen with blood on his hoodie and the gun still in his hand, saw the salvation that he did not want. He saw an adult, an authority figure, someone who would try to stop him. And he had already decided that stopping was not an option. Thomas Brennan saw the boy with the gun. There was perhaps a moment where he thought he could reason with him, could de-escalate, could save him. But Evan had already departed from the realm of reason. The gun fired. Thomas fell in the doorway, his final act an attempt to crawl toward help, toward a neighbor's house, toward the outside world. He made it 3 houses down before he collapsed on the Brennan porch, where a security camera had been recording the entire time, capturing the calm way Evan had walked away from the house at 10:04, adjusting his sleeves, pausing to step over a small pile of leaves, disappearing into the suburban night like a teenage boy coming home late from a friend's house. The violence from beginning to end had lasted exactly 47 seconds. The police response was rapid, coordinated, and overwhelming. 4 units arrived within 8 minutes of Thomas Brennan's 911 call. They found him conscious on his porch, bleeding from a chest wound that had just barely missed his heart. The paramedics worked fast. They had already been rolling when they heard the address. They cut his clothing away, established a line, got him moving toward County General with every intention of keeping him alive. Inside the Calder house, officers found the scene that would dominate news coverage for weeks. The clinical language of the police reports would later reduce everything to measurements and observations, bullet trajectories, blood spatter patterns, timestamps, victim positions. But in the moment, it was simple human horror. 2 people in a house, in the places where they slept, where they dreamed, where they believed themselves safe. The violence was efficiently executed and absolutely complete. The question then became, where was the shooter? The description went out immediately. A 14-year-old male, last seen leaving the residence in a dark hoodie, armed and dangerous. A tactical response began. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a boy matching the description. What they found was remarkable in its ordinariness. They found residents terrified, confused, unwilling to believe that this suburban street, this place of trimmed lawns and porch lights and neighborhood watches, could have become a crime scene. And then, at 11:40 p.m., they found Evan. He was 3 blocks away, sitting in the basement of his best friend's house. Marcus's house, coincidentally the same house from which he had stolen the gun. He was asleep on a pile of old blankets, the hoodie still on, his hands resting on his stomach like he didn't have a care in the world. He woke when the officers shined their lights on him. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply looked at them with what officers later described as a look of confusion, as if he couldn't understand why they were there. When they told him what had happened, when they said the names of the dead, he asked a single question. Am I going to prison? Not, what did I do? Not, I didn't mean to. Not, I'm sorry. Just a clinical question about his future, delivered in the same tone someone might use to ask about the weather. The interrogation room video would later be shown in court, and it would become the most chilling piece of evidence in the case. Evan sat across from the detective with his hands folded, calm and composed. He didn't ask for an attorney until he had already confessed to everything. He described the crime in clinical detail as if he was describing someone else's actions. I shot Richard 3 times, he said. The first shot probably would have killed him. I shot him twice more to make sure. Why? The detective asked. And Evan had paused, seeming to consider the question with genuine thoughtfulness before responding. He was always telling me what to do. He wouldn't let me do what I wanted. I was tired of it. What about Susan? She was in the way. That was the extent of his explanation for killing the woman who had bought him clothes, who had written in her journal about believing in him, who had stayed late at work to help other people's children, while her own foster son was planning her death. She was in the way. As for Thomas Brennan, Evan simply said, "He was going to stop me. I couldn't let him do that." The absence of remorse was noted by everyone present. The detective, a 20-year veteran named Frank Morrison, later told the prosecutor that he had interviewed murderers before. Men and women who had killed in anger, in desperation, in the fog of substance abuse or temporary insanity. And they all showed something: fear, sadness, confusion, some performance of remorse, genuine or otherwise. But Evan displayed none of this. He was detached, analytical, as if he was solving an equation that required him to explain his methodology. At one point, Frank asked him directly, "Do you feel bad about what you did?" And Evan had looked at him with something that might have been contempt and said, "I feel fine. I did what I had to do." That statement, videotaped and admissible, would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's psychological profile. A teenager who had committed premeditated murder and experienced no emotional consequence for those actions. The forensic evidence, meanwhile, was accumulating rapidly. The ballistics matched. The fingerprints were Evan's. The text messages were found on his phone, violent fantasies written in the preceding weeks. The search history was damning. The notebook with the sketches of the house was damning. Even the security footage from Thomas Brennan's doorbell camera was damning, showing the boy walking away with a kind of calm that suggested he had just stepped outside for a breath of fresh air rather than committed 3 acts of murder. By the time Evan was formally charged, the case had already been solved in the court of public opinion. What remained was to prosecute him, to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt, to determine whether a child could be tried as an adult. That would be the fight, not whether he did it, but what that doing meant legally, morally, and philosophically. Could a boy of 14 possess the kind of premeditation and depravity that justified an adult sentence? Could the system treat a child like a man if the child had chosen to act like something less than human? These were the questions that would occupy the courtroom for the next 6 months. And Evan, held in juvenile detention, seemed unconcerned. He ate well. He slept well. He showed no signs of depression or suicidal ideation or any of the psychological breaks that sometimes followed violent crime. He was, by all accounts, at peace. He had acted on the darkness inside him, and it had felt right. The world, he seemed to believe, would eventually recognize that, and he would be set free again. He had no conception of what was about to happen to him, no understanding of the machinery of justice that was about to grind into motion. He had committed his crime believing that age would protect him. He was about to learn what every generation of young criminals eventually learns, that the law is not kind, and that accountability does not care how old you are. The investigation proceeded with the kind of methodical precision that comes when the guilty party is already in custody and the evidence speaks for itself. Ballistics confirmed that the gun recovered from Marcus's house matched the bullets found in all 3 victims. The trajectory analysis matched the wound patterns. The forensic timeline was airtight. But beyond the physical evidence, beyond the bullets and the blood, and the forensic photographs, the investigation revealed something more damning. Evan had left a trail of intention so clear that it was almost as if he had wanted to be caught. The text messages were first. Police found conversations with Marcus dating back 3 months, discussing what would happen if someone just snapped, discussing how unfair it was that adults could control kids, discussing the fantasy of violence in the kind of coded language that adolescents use when they are planning something real. In one exchange, Marcus asked, "Dude, are you serious about this?" And Evan had responded, "Yeah, I'm done asking permission to live my life." Another message, sent 2 weeks before the crime. "You'll see. Some people deserve what's coming to them." The search history was equally damning. Evan had researched juvenile sentencing laws, looking specifically for what penalties minors received for murder. He had looked up the specific definition of premeditation. He had read articles about famous cases where teenagers had been tried as adults. He had even searched for information about appeals processes and rehabilitation programs. These were not the searches of someone acting on impulse. These were the researches of someone planning something, preparing for it, understanding the legal framework within which he would operate. He had also searched for ways to commit crimes without being detected, looked up information about destroying evidence, read about the capabilities of security cameras and doorbell cameras. The notebook found in his backpack was perhaps most revealing of all. It contained sketches of the Calder house, detailed observations about when people arrived and departed, notes about the presence of weapons in the house, and several pages of writing that the prosecution's psychologist would later describe as a psychological profile of someone operating with callous, unemotional traits. "Richard always acts like he's smarter than me," one entry read. "He makes me feel small. Susan pretends to care, but she's just trying to control me. I am done being controlled." The gun had been obtained through theft, yes, but the manner of that theft spoke to planning as well. Evan had identified that Marcus's father kept a firearm in the house. He had waited for the right moment. He had researched how to identify functional weapons. He had asked Marcus about security, about whether his parents checked their inventory regularly. Once he had stolen the gun, he had not simply possessed it. He had maintained it, cleaned it, practiced firing it. The dry fire exercises performed in his room at night had been noticed by neighbors who heard the clicking sound of the hammer striking the empty chamber. Several people had mentioned it to police, not realizing the significance at the time. But collected together, it created a picture of someone who was not acting on impulsive teenage rage, but on calculated intention. The school records provided additional context. Evan had been expelled from his previous school for an incident in which he had attacked another student with a textbook during a dispute over a grade. The aggression had been noted in his file as something that escalated beyond what would be expected from a typical teenage conflict. His guidance counselor at his new school had flagged him as a potential concern, noting that he demonstrated a pattern of blaming others for his problems, of rationalizing negative behaviors, and of showing little empathy for the consequences his actions had on others. A teacher had noted that when he was corrected, he would respond not with the typical teenage embarrassment or defensiveness, but with something colder, something that looked like resentment mixed with contempt. The accumulation of these observations, collected together in a folder marked with his name, created the portrait of a young person whose development had been compromised in some fundamental way. But perhaps the most compelling evidence was the simplest: his behavior after the crime. A typical murderer fleeing a crime scene operates in a state of adrenaline and panic. The body floods with stress hormones. The mind races. People often make mistakes in these conditions. They leave evidence behind. They act erratically. They behave in ways that invite investigation. Evan had done none of this. He had walked away from the house with his hands in his pockets. He had adjusted his clothing. He had gone to a friend's house and slept. The security footage showed no signs of panic, no running, no attempts to clean himself, no visible distress. It showed a teenager doing what teenagers do on a Tuesday night. This abnormal calm in the face of extreme violence was, in the prosecutor's assessment, more damning than any amount of bloody rambling would have been. It suggested that Evan had experienced this moment without the normal human emotional responses that should accompany it. It suggested that he was, as the forensic psychologist would later testify, fundamentally different from most people. When all of these pieces were gathered together, the evidence, the testimony, the digital trail, the photographs, the forensic analysis, the psychological evaluations, they created a case that was almost too perfect. The prosecutor, a woman named Helena Reeves, who had spent her career building cases against violent offenders, had never seen such a complete evidentiary package. Normally, there were gaps, witnesses who didn't see everything, evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways, psychological evaluations that contradicted each other. But this case had none of that. Everything pointed in the same direction. Everything built toward the same inevitable conclusion. Evan Calder had committed the crime. He had done so with premeditation. He had shown no remorse. And now the only remaining question was what the system would do with him. The psychological evaluation of Evan Calder was conducted over the course of 3 sessions by Dr. Margaret Chen, a forensic psychologist with 2 decades of experience evaluating juvenile offenders. She administered a battery of tests designed to measure personality traits, emotional regulation, capacity for empathy, and attachment styles. The results painted a picture that was clinically significant and deeply disturbing. Evan scored unusually high on narcissistic personality traits. He demonstrated what psychologists call callous unemotional characteristics, a reduced capacity to feel guilt, remorse, or empathy. His attachment style was classified as avoidant dismissive, which meant that he had learned early in his development that relationships were not safe and that vulnerability was a liability. He scored low on tests measuring empathy and theory of mind, the capacity to understand that other people had inner lives, thoughts, feelings, and perspectives separate from his own. When Dr. Chen interviewed him about the crime, Evan's responses were remarkable in their detachment. She asked him to describe his feelings during the act of violence. He described the feeling of pulling the trigger as efficient. He described watching his victims fall as what needed to happen. When asked whether he felt sadness about their deaths, he paused as if considering the question genuinely, and then responded, "I don't feel sad about things I chose to do. I feel sad when things happen to me that I don't choose. This distinction between grief that came from agency versus grief that came from victimization revealed something profound about his psychological architecture. He experienced himself as the center of the universe, the only consciousness whose feelings mattered. Other people were objects in his narrative, characters in his story. Not entities with their own legitimate experiences. This perspective was not something he had chosen or developed in response to trauma. Rather, it appeared to be a fundamental feature of his neurology, a difference in how his brain was wired that had perhaps existed from birth and had been amplified by years of behavioral choices. The question of whether this represented mental illness, psychopathy specifically, became a matter of significant debate. Dr. Chen concluded that Evan demonstrated many features consistent with psychopathic traits, though true psychopathy could not be fully diagnosed until adulthood. What was clear was that he did not show signs of other mental illnesses that might traditionally be offered as mitigating factors. He was not psychotic. He did not hear voices or experience delusions. He was not depressed. He was not impulsive in the way that mentally ill individuals often are. Instead, he was calculated. His violence had been planned. His behavior reflected choices made with what appeared to be cold rationality. The implications of this were significant for the legal case because it meant that the defense could not argue that he was suffering from a mental illness that had made him unable to control himself or understand his actions. Instead, what the case presented was something more troubling. Evidence of a person who understood his actions, understood their consequences, and chose them anyway. The question of remorse became central to the prosecution's case. In the courtroom, remorse carries weight. A person who commits violence and then experiences genuine regret is seen as fundamentally different from a person who commits violence and feels nothing. The law recognizes this distinction. Remorse is listed as a mitigating factor in sentencing guidelines. It suggests the possibility of rehabilitation. It suggests that punishment might change behavior in the future because the person has already changed internally. But Evan had no remorse to offer. This was not something he was pretending to lack. Multiple psychologists confirmed that his reported lack of remorse was genuine. He did not appear to be performing for the evaluation. Rather, he did not possess the capacity to feel the emotion that the system assumed would follow from committing murder. This absence was, in many ways, more damning than any amount of demonstrated malice would have been. His defense attorney, Derek Walsh, attempted to position this lack of remorse as evidence of a developmental disorder, arguing that Evan's capacity for emotional development was still forming and that the violent act might shock him into growth. This argument fell flat when the prosecutor presented evidence that Evan had demonstrated these traits: lack of empathy, narcissistic orientation, callous disregard for others' feelings, for years before the crime. This was not a temporary adolescent condition. This was his baseline personality. He had been this way since childhood, and rather than growing out of it, he had apparently grown into it, had become increasingly comfortable with violence as an expression of his will, had developed more sophisticated ways of rationalizing his own needs and desires above everyone else's lives. The question of whether such traits could change, whether rehabilitation was possible, was addressed by another expert witness, a criminologist who had spent years studying personality change in incarcerated individuals. The consensus was grim. Callous, unemotional traits in adolescence were one of the most resistant to change in the entire spectrum of personality disorders. While some offenders could be rehabilitated through intensive therapy and structured environment, those with deeply entrenched CU traits showed much less capacity for change. The brain patterns associated with empathy and remorse appeared to be neurologically different in these individuals, and without the neurological substrate, it was difficult, perhaps impossible, to teach someone to care about other people. This meant that Evan Calder, on a psychological level, might never experience remorse. He might never understand why what he had done was wrong. He might never develop the capacity to feel genuine guilt. And from the prosecution's perspective, this was an argument for a severe sentence. If rehabilitation was unlikely, then incapacitation became the primary justification for punishment. The defense attempted to offer an alternative narrative, suggesting that Evan's lack of remorse was itself evidence that he should not be tried as an adult, that a juvenile system designed for children still developing their capacity for moral reasoning was more appropriate. But the prosecution countered with the evidence of premeditation, of planning, of sophisticated understanding of the legal system itself. How could they argue that he was too immature to be tried as an adult when he had spent months researching juvenile sentencing laws and planning his actions in full awareness of the legal consequences? The psychological testimony, rather than mitigating his actions, had the effect of deepening the perception of danger he represented. The court was not evaluating a troubled teenager who had made a terrible mistake. It was evaluating a person who appeared to be fundamentally incapable of moral growth, and who had acted with that knowledge underlying his decision-making. The trial began on a cold Monday in November, 3 months after the crime. The courthouse had been selected from outside the county due to the intensity of media coverage and the difficulty of finding jurors who had not formed opinions about the case. The gallery filled quickly. Reporters, victim family members, neighbors who had lost their sense of safety, and the kind of true crime enthusiasts who seemed to treat murder trials like entertainment. The judge, Patricia Halloway, had a reputation for running a tight courtroom. She had dealt with high-profile cases before, with media pressure and community interest, and she had ways of managing both. She had already issued strict orders about media coverage, had limited what could be reported before trial, had created rules about courtroom decorum that would be enforced without exception. Evan arrived dressed in a gray suit that made him look even younger than he was. His attorney had made a calculation: present him as a child, as someone still developing, as someone whose terrible decisions were amplified by youth and immaturity. The psychology of appearance mattered in court. Everyone knew this. Juries make decisions based partly on evidence and partly on how they feel about the defendant. A young person in an oversized suit, looking small and vulnerable, would generate different responses than a young person dressed in the clothes of a gang member or a teenage rebel. It was manipulation, but it was legal manipulation, a recognized part of the adversarial system. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative construction. Helena Reeves walked the jury through the timeline. She showed them photographs of the victims. She made them see Richard Calder, Susan Calder, and Thomas Brennan, not as statistics, but as people, people with lives, with plans, with people who loved them. She described the crime with clinical precision, letting the facts speak for themselves. And then she made the pivot that would define the case. She looked directly at Evan and explained that this was not a case about a troubled teenager making a terrible mistake. This was a case about someone who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway because he valued his own freedom and his own comfort more than he valued the lives of the people who had tried to help him. The defense's opening was more tentative. Derek Walsh attempted to build sympathy, to introduce context about Evan's traumatic past, to suggest that this was a case of a broken system failing a broken child. But the strategy felt weak in the face of the evidence. What could he offer? That Evan had had a difficult childhood? The victims had had families who loved them. That Evan had wanted freedom? The victims wanted to live. The narrative calculus was running against him from the beginning. The trial proceeded with the testimony of crime scene investigators, of detectives, of the paramedics who had tried to save Thomas Brennan's life. Each witness added another layer to the evidentiary foundation. But the moment that would define the trial came on the third day, when the video of Evan's interrogation was played for the jury. As they watched him calmly describing the murders, his voice steady and his expression blank, something shifted in the courtroom. Jurors exchanged looks. One woman closed her eyes. Another took off her glasses and rubbed her face as if trying to wake from a nightmare. The judge watched all of this, noting reactions, understanding that the video had done more for the prosecution than hours of testimony could have accomplished. The jury was seeing what Evan actually was, not a troubled kid, but someone operating according to a fundamentally different set of values. During cross-examination, Derek Walsh attempted to challenge the prosecution's narrative. He suggested that Evan had been in a dissociative state, that perhaps he had not truly understood what he was doing, that the calm demeanor could be explained by trauma response rather than callousness. But Evan himself undermined these arguments. When asked by the judge to describe his mental state during the crime, he explained it in a way that was devastatingly clear. I was focused. I knew what I wanted to do, and I did it. I wasn't confused. I wasn't angry. I was just doing what needed to be done. That response, I was just doing what needed to be done, seemed to crystallize the case for the jury. This was not someone operating under the fog of mental illness. This was someone who had acted with purpose and clarity. As the trial progressed, the courtroom dynamics became increasingly tense. Evan's mother wept throughout the proceedings, but Evan himself remained unmoved. During breaks, he would speak with his attorney in the kind of animated, casual way that suggested he found the trial interesting but not emotionally significant. He would laugh at jokes made by courthouse personnel. He would ask Derek Walsh about the procedural details of the trial, seeming to treat it as an intellectual exercise rather than as a fight for his freedom. The jury noticed all of this. They watched him react, or fail to react, to testimony about his victims. They saw his expressions when photographs were shown. And what they saw consistently was a young person who appeared fundamentally unconcerned about what was happening around him. Twice Evan smiled in a courtroom. Once when a piece of forensic evidence was excluded on a technical basis, and once when the defense attorney won a small procedural victory. But he never smiled when the victims were named. He never showed any sign of emotional response to testimony about the suffering his actions had caused. The evidence presented during the trial's second week was methodical and overwhelming. The prosecution had built its case like a house of cards, carefully constructed to stand against any challenge, and as each piece of evidence was presented, the structure became more impossible to deny. The ballistics expert testified that the bullets recovered from all three victims matched the gun found in Marcus's house with mathematical certainty. The fingerprint evidence was presented next. Evan's prints on the gun, on the doorknob of the bedroom, on the knife used in the crime. The prosecutor walked the jury through the probability calculations. The chance of these fingerprints belonging to someone other than Evan was 1 in several billion. The forensic timeline was then laid out in detail. A retired judge from the State Forensic Board explained how investigators had determined the sequence of events based on blood spatter, ballistic trajectory, and wound characteristics. Every aspect of the physical evidence supported the prosecution's narrative of the crime. The digital evidence followed. An expert from the FBI explained how the text messages had been extracted from Evan's phone and from Marcus's phone, how the deletion of messages did not actually erase them from the phone's memory, how they had recovered conversations that Evan had tried to remove. The messages were presented in chronological order, showing the progression from fantasy to planning to the night of the crime itself. In one message sent on the evening of September 15th, just 2 hours before the murders, Evan had written to Marcus, "This is my last night at that house." The prosecution asked the expert, could this message be interpreted any way other than as indicating premeditation? The expert responded that based on the context, based on the other messages, based on the timing, it was difficult to interpret it as anything other than an indicator that Evan had already decided to commit violence. The search history was presented next. Hours of online research into juvenile sentencing, into appeals processes, into crime scene cleanup, into ways to avoid detection. The prosecution walked through each search methodically, building the narrative that this was not an impulsive act, this was not a moment of teenage rage that had spiraled out of control. This was calculated. This was planned. This was the product of weeks of preparation and research. The defense attempted to challenge this during cross-examination, suggesting that teenagers searched the Internet for all kinds of things, that the presence of these searches did not necessarily indicate intent, but the prosecutor would return to the timeline. All of these searches had occurred in the weeks leading up to the crime. The searches had escalated in intensity as the date approached. And the searches were specific, focused, not the kind of random browsing that teenagers typically did. They were goal-oriented. They were purposeful. The psychological evaluation was presented next, with Dr. Chen testifying for the prosecution. She described Evan's psychological profile in language that the jury could understand. She explained that callous, unemotional traits were different from other personality disorders. They were not caused by trauma or by mental illness. They appeared to be neurological. They made the person less likely to experience fear, less likely to experience guilt or shame, more likely to act on impulse and desire without the normal emotional breaks that inhibited other people. She was asked by the prosecutor whether, in her opinion, these traits made someone more or less likely to commit violence. She responded carefully, noting that the presence of these traits alone did not cause violence, but when combined with opportunity and reduced fear of consequences, they significantly elevated the risk of violent behavior. And what did that mean in Evan's case? The prosecutor pressed her. Dr. Chen responded, "It means that Evan Calder appears to have been someone who was less inhibited by normal human fears and more capable of acting on violent impulses without the usual psychological barriers that prevent most people from committing murder." The defense had its own psychological expert who testified that adolescent development was still incomplete, that teenagers by definition had reduced capacity for impulse control and for understanding long-term consequences. But the prosecution undermined this by presenting evidence of Evan's extensive planning, his research into the legal system, his careful preparation over weeks. If his adolescent brain was unable to think about consequences, why had he spent so much time researching consequences? If he lacked impulse control, how had he managed to wait 6 weeks between obtaining the gun and using it? The defense expert's argument that Evan was just a typical adolescent who made a terrible decision did not align with the evidence. Evan was not a typical adolescent. He was an adolescent who had done something deliberately, calculatedly, and without any of the normal adolescent guilt or panic that should have followed. The prosecution's closing argument tied all of the evidence together into a coherent narrative. Helena Reeves walked the jury through the timeline one more time, but this time with the weight of all the evidence behind her. She showed them photographs of the victims. She played clips from the interrogation video. She reminded them of the psychological evaluation. And then she asked them a simple question. What does the evidence tell you? Does it tell you about a confused teenager who made a terrible mistake? Or does it tell you about someone who understood exactly what he was doing and did it because he valued his own freedom more than 3 human lives? The evidence, she argued, was clear. It was unambiguous. It pointed in only one direction. The only question remaining was what the system would do about it. The victim impact statements, which occurred at the end of the trial, transformed the courtroom from a place of legal procedure into a place of human devastation. The prosecutor had coached the families on how to speak, how to manage their emotions, how to make the jury understand not just the facts of the crime, but the ripples of loss that extended outward from those 3 deaths. The first to speak was Richard Calder's brother, who stood in front of the jury with a trembling voice and explained that he had just lost his brother, that his brother had died trying to create a safe space for a child who had rejected that safety. He described Richard's joy at becoming a foster parent, his belief in second chances, his conviction that love and structure could redirect a life. He described the funeral. He described the silence in the Calder home now. And he looked at Evan and asked him a question that went unanswered. Did you think about any of that? Did you think about what you would take from him? What you would take from all of us? Susan Calder's sister was next. She had been the one to call the police that night, the one to respond when her sister's house had filled with the sound of gunshots. She described Susan's work as a guidance counselor, the way she had stayed late helping other people's children. She described Susan's optimism, her journals, her belief in Evan's potential. And then she described finding the house, finding her sister, understanding what had been taken from the world. She wept as she spoke, and the jury wept with her. One juror had to leave the room. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence in the courtroom. Even the judge looked away, composing herself. Thomas Brennan had a daughter who had not spoken to him in 3 years, a estrangement that had lasted long enough that they had only recently been trying to reconcile. She stood in front of the jury and explained this with a voice that seemed to break with each word. "I was going to call him," she said. "I was going to call and say I was sorry for the time we lost. And now I won't get to do that. Now I'll never get to tell him that I forgive him for whatever distances grew between us. I'll never get to say goodbye. And that is what this has taken from me, not just my father, but the chance to make things right with him before it was too late." She looked at the judge. She did not look at Evan. She did not need to. Her words had already made clear that his crime had been a theft of something more than just 3 lives. It had been a theft of futures, of reconciliations, of moments yet to happen. The prosecution allowed a moment of silence after the victim impact statements concluded. Then they rested their case. The gallery was quiet. Some people were crying. Others sat in stunned contemplation. The weight of what had been lost, the weight of what 3 people's deaths had taken from the world, had been made tangible. No amount of legal argument could undo what the families had just articulated. The jury had heard from the people who had actually experienced the consequences of Evan's decision. And that testimony, while not technically evidence, had an impact that no expert witness could replicate. The defense made a final attempt to contextualize the crime, to remind the jury that Evan was 14, that his brain was still developing, that the system had options short of adult sentencing that could still hold him accountable while allowing for growth. But the argument fell flat against the weight of what had just been presented. The jury had seen the evidence. The jury had heard from the families. The jury had watched Evan in the courtroom and seen his fundamental indifference to the suffering he had caused. They were ready to render a verdict. The judge called for a short recess to allow the jury to begin deliberations. When they left the courtroom, there was a sense that the outcome had already been determined, that evidence and emotion and psychology had aligned to create something that felt like inevitability. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of discussion, of argument, of examining evidence. 2 days during which the family members sat in the courthouse, unable to do anything but wait. On the evening of the 2nd day, word came that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled again. The gallery was packed. Media representatives lined the back. The judge took the bench. The jury filed in, and prosecutors had always noted that you could tell something about the verdict by whether the jurors would look at the defendant. If they were going to convict, they generally wouldn't make eye contact. If they had doubts, they might. All 12 jurors refused to look at Evan as they took their seats. The charges were read. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder 3 times. Premeditation. Depravity of heart. Each count carried the weight of that verdict, and with each guilty, something seemed to shift in the courtroom. The family showed emotion, some crying, some sitting in stunned silence, some nodding, as if something they had always known had finally been made official. Evan's reaction was the one that would be analyzed for years afterward. His face flushed. Not with shame, observers noted, but with anger. His hands clenched into fists. For the first time in the entire trial, his careful mask of indifference cracked. He had been so certain, it seemed, so convinced that the system would treat him with lenience, that the jury would buy his youth as an excuse. And now, faced with the reality that they had not, something that looked like rage flashed across his features. He turned to his attorney and said something, words not picked up by the microphones, but his lips made clear. "This is wrong." Derek Walsh placed a hand on his shoulder, but Evan shook it off. The judge watched this display of emotion, this sudden emergence of something he had managed to keep hidden throughout the trial. She allowed it to continue for a moment, allowed the jury to see him, allowed the families to see him, and then she called for order. Within seconds, Evan composed himself again, but the moment had occurred. The mask had slipped, and in that slipping, people had caught a glimpse of something underneath the careful performance of indifference. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. This would be the moment when the question of whether to try him as an adult would be fully addressed. The defense would argue for juvenile sentencing, which would cap his punishment at detention until age 21, with the possibility of release before that if he demonstrated rehabilitation. The prosecution would argue for adult sentencing, which would mean a substantial prison sentence, potentially life. All of the evidence would be revisited. The psychological evaluations would be re-examined. The question of whether rehabilitation was possible would be central to the proceedings. During those 3 weeks of waiting, the media coverage intensified. The case had become national news, a story about the failure of the foster care system, about the dangers of undiagnosed personality disorders, about the question of whether society could afford to treat violent adolescents as children. Talk shows debated the question. Legal experts argued about precedent. The community remained divided. Some people believed that Evan deserved mercy because of his age. Others believed that showing mercy to someone who had shown none was a betrayal of the victims. Evan remained in juvenile detention, awaiting the decision that would determine whether he would spend his next years in a facility designed for teenagers or in an adult prison surrounded by hardened criminals. Sentencing day arrived with a strange weather phenomenon, a perfect autumn day, sunny and mild, the kind of day that seemed indifferent to human tragedy. Judge Patricia Halloway took the bench and looked out at a courtroom that was even more packed than it had been for the verdict. The families were there. The community members were there. The media was there. And Evan was there, again in his gray suit, again trying to present himself as young and vulnerable. But the jury had already made its decision about what he was. Now it was the judge's turn. She began by reviewing the case, going through the facts methodically. 3 victims, premeditated violence, a teenager who had researched the legal system and acted anyway, a teenager who had shown no remorse and had displayed anger only when confronted with consequences. She read from the psychological evaluation, letting the words about callous, unemotional traits and reduced capacity for empathy hang in the courtroom. She referenced the text messages, the search history, the videotaped interrogation. She read from the victim impact statements, particularly the section where Thomas Brennan's daughter had spoken about the reconciliation that would never happen. And then she turned to the question of rehabilitation. Could Evan Calder be rehabilitated? The defense argued yes, pointing to his youth, to the possibility of change over time, to programs designed to help adolescents develop empathy and moral awareness. But the judge addressed this directly. The question of rehabilitation is not whether change is theoretically possible, she said. The question is whether, given this individual and his demonstrated characteristics, rehabilitation is likely, and the evidence suggests that it is not. This is not a case of a teenager who committed a terrible act and immediately experienced remorse and horror at what he had done. This is a case of a teenager who committed a terrible act, felt nothing about it, and was surprised and angry only when the system refused to let him escape the consequences. That pattern of thinking, that fundamental orientation toward the world, is not easily changed. She went on to address the question of public safety. The court must consider, she explained, whether this individual poses a danger to the community. The evidence suggests that he does. He has shown no remorse. He has shown no capacity to empathize with his victims. He has shown an orientation toward violence as a solution to problems. He has shown a capacity for planning and deception. These are the hallmarks of someone who is likely to engage in further violence if given the opportunity. The question then becomes, does the community have the right to protect itself from individuals who have shown themselves to be dangerous? And the answer is yes. The system has a responsibility to protect potential future victims from someone who has already demonstrated his capacity and willingness to kill. The judge paused, letting that statement settle. She looked directly at Evan and spoke words that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. You believe that your age would protect you. You believe that being 14 years old would earn you sympathy from a system designed to help children. But you were not a child acting on childish impulses. You were a young person who understood exactly what you were doing. You understood that killing is wrong. You understood that the people in your home did not deserve to die. And you did it anyway, because your desires mattered more to you than their lives. That is not something that age excuses. That is not something that rehabilitation can fix. That is a choice you made with full knowledge of what you were choosing, and you will face the adult consequences of that choice. The judge then moved to the actual sentencing. I have considered all relevant factors, she said. I have considered your age. I have considered your background. I have considered the recommendations of the prosecution and the defense. And I have concluded that this case requires an adult sentence. You will be tried as an adult, and you will be sentenced as an adult. The words fell like stones in still water. The families gasped. Evan's mother made a sound that was almost inhuman, a kind of wail that she tried to suppress but could not fully contain. The judge continued, You are sentenced to 3 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life for the 3 counts of first-degree murder. You will be eligible for parole after 25 years have been served. Given the nature of your crimes, the premeditation involved, and your demonstrated lack of remorse, I expect that parole will be denied at that time, and that you will serve substantially longer than that minimum. In addition, you are sentenced to an additional 10 years for the assault on Thomas Brennan, a man who has shown remarkable strength in surviving your attack and in not allowing bitterness to define his response. 75 years, not quite life, but close enough that Evan Calder would be an old man before he had any realistic possibility of freedom. The courtroom erupted. Some people applauded, and the judge did not stop them. She let the moment stand. She allowed the community to respond to the sentence, and then she called for order and addressed Evan one more time. You came into this courtroom believing that the system would treat you as a child. You came in believing that your youth would be your salvation. Instead, you have learned that justice does not care about your age. Justice cares about your actions, and your actions have taken 3 people from this world. You will spend the majority of your life in prison as a consequence of those actions. That is not harsh, that is not unfair, that is justice. The gavel fell. The sentence was official. Evan was led away by bailiffs, his stoic expression finally cracking. For a moment, as he was being escorted from the courtroom, he looked small again. 14 years old, shocked, confronted for the first time with the full weight of what his choices had created. The gallery waited until he had been removed, and then people began to leave. The families gathered. The prosecutors shook hands. The judge left the bench, and outside the courtroom, as reporters gathered to film segments about the verdict, one thing was clear. The system had not treated Evan Calder as a child. It had treated him as what he had shown himself to be, a dangerous individual who had killed and felt nothing about it, and who deserved to spend the majority of his remaining years separated from a world he had shown himself incapable of living in peacefully. In the days following sentencing, the community processed what had happened. The families held a private memorial service for their loved ones, a ceremony that was not covered by media, but that allowed them to begin the long process of grieving without the intrusion of cameras and reporters. Thomas Brennan, the survivor, gave a brief statement to the press. He said, "I forgive him, but I do not believe that forgiveness requires forgetting what he did or pretending that justice was not served. The judge was right. Justice requires consequences, and the consequence he received is appropriate." He then retreated from public view, returning to his home, where he would spend months recovering from both his physical wounds and the trauma of nearly dying. The foster care system faced intense scrutiny. How had Evan Calder slipped through the cracks? How had caseworkers not recognized the danger he represented? Investigations were launched, reports were filed, new protocols were implemented. Foster agencies began requiring more extensive psychological evaluations, more detailed background checks, more careful matching of children with families. It was a systemic reckoning, one that had been necessary, but that came too late to help Richard and Susan Calder. Evan Calder was transferred from juvenile detention to an adult prison facility in the central part of the state. He was placed in protective custody, kept separate from the general population, because young offenders in adult prisons often face extreme violence. He was assigned to work details. He was given access to educational programs. But he did not seem to engage with any of this. He remained withdrawn, isolating himself, refusing to participate in group activities. Whether this was depression or simply the continuation of his basic personality was unclear. The guards noted that he seemed to be adjusting to incarceration without difficulty, without the usual emotional struggle that many prisoners experience. The case became a subject of academic study. Law schools used it as a case study in juvenile justice. Psychology departments used Evan's psychological profile as an example of callous, unemotional traits. Criminology researchers cited the case when discussing the question of whether rehabilitation was possible for certain individuals. The judge's final statement, "Justice does not care about your age," became a famous line quoted in legal arguments and in public discourse about juvenile justice. It represented a moment when the system had decided that some crimes, some individuals, were beyond the scope of the juvenile system's intended purpose, which was to rehabilitate children. Instead, society had decided that it had the right and the responsibility to protect itself from people who had shown themselves to be dangerous. A documentary was made about the case. It aired on a streaming platform and was watched by millions of people. It featured interviews with the judge, with the prosecutors, with community members, with legal experts debating whether the sentence was appropriate. It included footage of the trial, of the courtroom reactions, of the moment when the gavel fell. And it ended with the question that everyone was asking: could this have been prevented? If the foster care system had worked differently, if the psychological evaluation had happened earlier, if Evan had been properly assessed before being placed with a family, could those three people still be alive? The answer, according to the documentary, was that we would never know. All we could know was what had happened and what came after. Years passed. Evan Calder aged in prison. His initial conviction that his youth would protect him gave way to the slower, more painful recognition that he would spend decades, possibly his entire life, incarcerated. The anger that had flashed when the verdict was read faded into a kind of resigned acceptance. He was neither a model prisoner nor a particularly troublesome one. He was simply a man serving a sentence, counting days that would eventually become years and then decades. The psychological evaluations continued. The prison psychiatrists and psychologists regularly assessed him to see if there had been any change, any development of capacity for remorse or empathy. The findings were consistent. Evan continued to demonstrate callous, unemotional traits. He showed no signs of developing genuine remorse. He blamed others for his predicament. The system had failed him. The foster care workers had mistreated him. The judge had been unfair. The only thing that had changed was that he had become skilled at performing the appearance of change when required. He had learned how to say the words that counselors wanted to hear. He had learned that compliance and apparent remorse could improve his circumstances in small ways. But it was performance, not transformation. He had not changed at his core. He had only learned to hide more effectively. The judge, Patricia Halloway, retired a few years after the trial. In her final years on the bench, she continued to preside over other cases, other trials, other moments when the system had to reckon with violence and justice. But she would occasionally be asked about the Calder case, and she always gave the same response. She was not proud of sentencing a teenager to 75 years in prison, but she was confident that it was the right decision. Justice is not about punishment for punishment's sake, she would say in interviews. Justice is about protecting society and providing consequences proportional to harm caused. In that case, I believe we achieved that, and I would make the same decision again. The case remained in the legal consciousness as a reference point in debates about juvenile justice. Advocates for harsh sentencing pointed to it as evidence that some cases required adult consequences. Advocates for reformed juvenile justice pointed to it as evidence that the system had failed a troubled child and that earlier intervention might have prevented tragedy. Both sides used the case to support their arguments because the case was complex enough to support multiple narratives. Yes, Evan Calder had shown dangerous psychological characteristics from an early age. But yes, the system might have identified and addressed those characteristics if it had been adequately funded and prioritized. Yes, his crime was terrible and his lack of remorse was disturbing. But yes, sentencing a child to 75 years in prison represented the system's failure as much as his failure. The question that lingered, the question that had no satisfying answer, was this: could anything have changed Evan Calder's trajectory? If the foster care workers had been trained to recognize callous, unemotional traits, if the psychological evaluation had happened earlier, if intensive psychiatric treatment had been provided, if Richard and Susan Calder had been warned about the danger signs, if the neighbor, Thomas Brennan, had been aware of the risk and had taken different precautions, would 3 people still be alive? The documentary makers, the legal experts, the journalists who covered the case had all asked this question, and no one had a definitive answer. What they knew was that systems had failed. People had died. A teenager had been revealed to be something more dangerous than his age suggested. And the law, in the form of Judge Patricia Halloway, had decided that society's right to protect itself superseded the system's traditional commitment to rehabilitation of minors. Evan Calder sits in his prison cell now, a man in his 20s who will likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. He has not experienced any transformation. He has not developed remorse. He has not found religion or therapy or any of the conventional paths toward healing and rehabilitation. He simply exists in a cage, counted every day, aware of exactly how many days remain until he might be eligible for parole, aware that parole will likely be denied, aware that he will probably die in prison. He came into a courtroom with a smirk, confident that youth would protect him, certain that his age was his shield. He left that courtroom understanding, finally and irrevocably, that neither age nor charm nor intelligence could protect him from consequences of his own choosing. The system, through the voice of the judge, had made clear that justice does not care about your age. Justice cares about your actions. And his actions had taken 3 lives and shattered one of the most fundamental promises of the American justice system. The promise that children could be rehabilitated, that families could heal, that second chances existed for those young enough to deserve them. 14-year-old kills 3 people and shows no remorse until the judge destroys his ego. 14-year-old Evan Calder walked into that courtroom with his chin held high and a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 3 people were dead. 3. His foster parents. A neighbor who tried to stop him. The judge read the charges with a voice heavy as stone. First-degree murder ×3. And Evan? He swung his feet like a bored student in study hall. He mouthed the word okay to his attorney, as if the prosecutor had just asked him to pass the salt. 14 years old, 3 bodies, and not a shred of fear in his eyes. He honestly believed his age would save him. He had no idea the judge was about to teach him the most brutal lesson of his life. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. No matter how young the perpetrator or how confident they are in escaping it. If you believe in real accountability and the power of the law to restore balance, subscribe now and tell us in the comments what you think justice truly means. Does age excuse intent? Let's discuss below. Now this is how it all began. The truth is, Evan Calder came into his foster home with a history already written. Records of expulsions, anger management failures, and escalating aggression. His foster parents, Richard and Susan, took him in anyway. They were the kind of people who believed in second chances, who saw potential where the system saw risk. They set rules, curfews at 10, screens off at 9, respect at all times. These weren't cruel boundaries. They were the scaffolding of structure that Evan had never had. Susan kept a journal. In one entry from 3 months before the crime, she wrote, "Today Evan smiled at dinner. A real smile. I think he's finally starting to trust us." She had no way of knowing that behind that smile lived something else entirely. Something cold and calculating that watched the neighborhood from his window at night. Something that had already begun planning the unthinkable. The courtroom fell silent when the bailiff called the case. Evan Calder's name echoed off the walls like a question no one wanted answered. He wore a gray hoodie that made him look smaller than his frame actually was, a calculated choice by his public defender. 14 looked younger than 25. 14 looked like it might deserve mercy. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Halloway, had seen 17 years on the bench and could smell a performance from across the room. She watched as Evan shuffled to his seat, his mother in the gallery behind him, her face already broken before the charges were even read. The courtroom was packed, reporters in the back, family members in the front rows, the kind of attention that only 3 deaths in a quiet suburb could summon. The air felt heavy, pressurized, like the moment before a storm breaks. When the prosecutor stood to read the indictment, her voice was steady and clinical. 3 counts of first-degree murder, premeditation, cruelty, depravity of heart. The words hung in the air like objects you could almost touch. Evan's lawyer, a man named Derek Walsh, who had already aged 10 years fighting an unwinnable case, placed a hand on his client's shoulder. But Evan wasn't listening to the charges. He was looking at the gallery, at the empty chairs where his victims' families sat, and something flickered across his face. Not fear, not sadness, but something closer to amusement. When the prosecutor said the names aloud, Richard Calder, Susan Calder, Thomas Brennan, Evan's foot began to swing under the table, a rhythmic motion like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. The courtroom photographer caught it. The image would later run in newspapers across 3 states. A child sneaker swinging, indifferent, while justice tried to answer for the dead. The detective's report was read into the record first. Evan had been arrested 18 hours after the crime, found asleep in his best friend's basement, the murder weapon already recovered and logged as evidence. There had been no chase, no drama, no moment of teenage panic. He had simply walked away from the house on Meridian Street at 10:52 p.m., adjusted his hoodie in the glow of a neighbor's doorbell camera, and disappeared into the Tuesday night like someone leaving a movie theater. The detective described the scene with the kind of detachment that only comes from years of documenting human tragedy. The bedroom walls, the kitchen floor, the neighbor's front porch where Thomas Brennan had fallen trying to call for help. 47 seconds. That was how long the violence lasted according to the forensic timeline. 47 seconds of sound and fury that would echo through a community for years. And Evan had walked away from it in under 3 minutes, his heart rate probably stable, his hands probably steady. His mind already composing the lie he would tell when caught. The courtroom observers, seasoned crime reporters who had covered murders in the city's worst neighborhoods, found themselves disturbed by something other than the facts. It was his stillness. A typical 14-year-old defendant cried, fidgeted, showed some sign of the internal collapse that should come with facing such charges. Evan sat like he was waiting for a bus. During the reading of the forensic evidence, when photographs of the crime scene were shown to the judge and jury, Evan actually turned to look at the evidence table, examining it with the kind of casual interest someone might show when looking at a neighbor's car. His attorney whispered something urgent to him, a warning probably, to show more appropriate emotion, but Evan simply nodded and turned back to face forward. Judge Holloway watched all of it. She was writing notes, not looking at the defendant, but her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. She had seen plenty of guilty men in her courtroom. Most of them at least had the basic human decency to appear disturbed by what they had done. Evan Calder looked like he was thinking about what he wanted for lunch. By the time the prosecution rested its opening statement, the narrative was already clear to everyone present. A troubled teenager imported into a stable home had rejected the structure and kindness offered to him. He had stolen a handgun from his friend's garage 3 weeks prior. He had researched online whether minors could receive life sentences. He had written in his school journal, seized by police, entered as evidence that he was tired of being controlled. And then, on a Tuesday evening in September, he had acted. The violence was swift and methodical. The escape was calm and calculated. And now, sitting in a courtroom surrounded by the consequences of his actions, he had the audacity to look bored. The jury members were taking notes, but their eyes kept returning to the same question. How does a child become this? What break occurs in a 14-year-old mind that allows him to commit 3 murders and then sit in a courtroom with the kind of emotional distance most people reserve for waiting in line at the grocery store? Judge Holloway had her own theory. She had read the psychological evaluations, the trauma history, the incident reports from his previous placements. But she would save her judgment for later. For now, the trial had to proceed. The facts had to be presented. The evidence had to be examined. And Evan Calder would have to watch as everyone in that room, the judge, the jury, the families, the reporters, came to understand exactly what he was. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but already in the silence of that courtroom, It felt like a sentence had been written. Richard Calder was a man who believed in systems. He worked in logistics, managing supply chains for a manufacturing company, the kind of job that required precision, planning, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. At 48 years old, he had a structured routine: coffee at 5:30, the gym at 6, the office by 8, dinner at 6 in the evening. His wife, Susan, was a middle school guidance counselor who believed in second chances with the kind of fervor that only comes from having worked with enough broken teenagers to know that brokenness isn't permanent. Together, they had created a home on Meridian Street that was stable in a way that made neighbors feel safe just walking past it. The lawn was trimmed every Saturday. The house was painted a soft blue with white trim. There were flower beds that Susan tended with surgical precision, and a porch where they sat on summer evenings with glasses of iced tea and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from two people who have learned to live well together. They had wanted children, biological children, but biology hadn't cooperated, and after years of procedures and heartbreak, they had made a different choice: foster care. It was noble in theory, and it had led to 3 successful placements before Evan arrived. A girl named Melissa had lived with them for 14 months and had gone on to graduate high school and attend community college. A boy named Marcus had stayed for 9 months before being reunited with his father, and another girl, Jenny, had been with them for 2 years before aging out of the system and moving into a group home. These placements had reinforced Richard and Susan's belief that they had something to offer, that a home with structure and genuine care could redirect a life headed toward darkness. They were not naive. The agency had prepared them for behavioral issues, emotional dysregulation, the kind of trauma that follows a child who has been neglected or abused. They were ready for challenges. They were not ready for what Evan would bring. The file on Evan was substantial. 3 previous placements, all ended by request of the foster parents. 2 expulsions from school for fighting and insubordination. A battery charge when he was 12. He had beaten another student with a textbook after being corrected in class. Anger management counseling, failed. Psychiatric evaluation, inconclusive. The caseworker who brought him to Meridian Street had been honest. He's a difficult placement, but he's also intelligent and capable of bonding when he feels respected. Give him structure and genuine interest, and you might reach him. Richard and Susan had nodded, taken notes, and welcomed him into their home with the kind of optimistic determination that made people love them, even when their choices seemed reckless.